So, what churches of Christ were we involved in? And those of you watching this may or may not have heard of the churches of Christ. I had heard of them, but I didn't really know much about them. In our video, in our very first podcast where we talk about leaving the charismatic movement, we talk in there about how we had ran into a preacher in Lehman's, and he is from the Church of Christ. And I remember he gave us a business card, and I looked it up on the internet. I wanted to know a little bit of what they were about, and there was really no red flags. They seemed very conservative, but honestly, at the time, Kenny and I were looking for something very simple.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk a little bit because the Church of Christ, there's so many different groups, and I do want to be careful about not broad brushing all of them. So I want to talk specifically about the groups that we were recruited into. So to go clear back to the beginning, the Churches of Christ came out of the Restorationist movement. This was actually brought up to us by the preacher that we first studied with. He said they were a Restoration church, and I don't remember the exact verbiage he used, but I do know in the beginning, he said they were. In fact, he made a comparison between Restoration and Reformation, because he said he brought up the Reformation and how it had ended up in all of these denominations. And he said, when you reform something, you change it. And when you restore something, you take it back to the original. And so my point is they use that word restoration. And we never checked it out in the beginning. We heard that word, but we just kind of brushed it aside and went on. So the Restoration movement started in 1809 by a man named Thomas Campbell. And he gave a speech called the Declaration and Address. Basically, Thomas Campbell was a Presbyterian, and he had two main beefs. He did not agree with baptizing or sprinkling babies, and he also he was in the United States around the Kentucky area when all of the revivals were going on and things were kind of getting crazy. And so he wanted to restore Christianity back to simple Christianity. That was his goal. He believed that only adult believers should be baptized, and they should be baptized by immersion. So those were his two big things. So I'm going to post a link to the Declaration and Address just for those of you who are curious and want to read it. It's not very long, and you can kind of see what Thomas Campbell's heart was. That's officially when it was launched. And then in 1884, there was a guy named Austin McGrary that argued that baptisms were not valid unless the believer went under the water believing it was for the remission of sins. And so to this day, in the majority of your conservative churches of Christ, the McGrary view is the prevailing view. So and then in 1889, there was a man named Daniel Summer who gave a speech called the Sand Creek Address. And this is the real historical point where there was a major split within basically the churches of Christ separated from the Christian churches. So the non-institutional institutional split was made official in 1906. From that split, the non-institutional churches also split again into instrumental, non-instrumental. And so the non-instrumental churches were the most conservative. And so I hope I'm not being too confusing. Basically, where you are today is Kenny and I were involved in the non-institutional, non-instrumental churches of Christ, which in these times make up about 10% of all churches of Christ. So it is, in the whole scheme of things, a pretty small amount. Most churches of Christ have their core doctrines in common. For example, a core doctrine would be they believe that baptism is required for salvation. They believe that when you're baptized, that's the point that your sins are washed away. Churches of Christ believe that you can lose your salvation. There is widely varying views. You've got the most conservative churches of Christ that believe that every sin we commit could potentially damn us to hell. And you've got other ones that believe that you really have to be in a long-term pattern. So again, there's widely varying views, but the core doctrines are you can lose your salvation and baptism is required for salvation. Beyond that, and this is where Kenny mentioned legalism. So the churches that we were involved in are the non-instrumental, non-institutional. When I say non-instrumental, most of these groups believe that instrumental churches of Christ are in sin. They're not faithful. So they take these very seriously. So we were recruited into the most legalistic of the churches of Christ. There's quite a few. In fact, I'm at some point going to make a list of all of the ones. There's quite a few here in the central Ohio area. They're all over Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania. And so, like I said, they make up approximately 10 to 20% of all churches of Christ. And we're going to go into this in depth too. Kenny and I have thought about this. In fact, it wasn't even until we decided to leave and how all of that happened. We never were willing to use the word cult.
Right.
Not until the very end. We would sometimes say some of their tendencies were cultish, but never would we have used the word cult until the very end and how that went down, which we'll go into. And that's ultimately one of the reasons why we decided to make this video series is because of the damage it did and how it was almost like you read about an Amish or a Mormon shunning. When we came to them with our concerns on doctrine and said, hey, we don't agree with these things, there was a desire to study, but that was only to get us to believing correctly.
Yeah.
But when it was discovered that we were not budging, it was I don't think you should come back. And so all churches of Christ are considered autonomous. So there's no governing body. Each church is separate from other churches. Unlike, for example, a lot of your Baptist churches are under the Southern Baptist Convention authority. The church circles that we were in, some people refer to them as old school churches of Christ, or some refer to them as hardline churches of Christ. They're all the same. And, again, Kenny and I have sat and had many conversations about what took us so long to see this. And we came to the conclusion that it's because they won't come out and say, for example, they will never say that they believe everyone outside the Church of Christ is hellbound. You really have to present the question in the right way. What they'll say is things like, well,
Jesus only has one church.
Jesus only has one church. Or they'll say, because the church Kenny and I went to was a non-denominational, so we weren't in a denomination. But let's say that you were a Baptist. They would open their Bible and say, well, I don't see Baptist in here. Or if you went to a Methodist church, well, I don't see Methodist in here. And they'll say things like, Jesus only built one church. And that's true.
Right.
He did only build one church.
We don't disagree with that.
And so we just wanted to take a minute before we go into this video series. We wanted those of you watching, in case there's anybody in the Church of Christ watching, because I've had a few people in the church message me, in the Church of Christ. I've had a few people message me that knew we were working on this video series, and they were concerned that we were not going to broad brush everybody in the Church of Christ as a cult. And we're not.
No.
I would never name them, but I know there's several good men in the Church of Christ that do not believe that if you're not in a Church of Christ, you're going to hell.
Right.
And so I really respect them. And so I think that's why we wanted to just do this short video to tell you what churches we were in, and we will methodically go through and explain their doctrine and why we came to that conclusion that we believe that those particular circles are dangerous in pushing people away.